Good morning. In this video, we are going to discuss some slides on the cardiovascular system, and we will start by the pericardium. And the pericardium is a tough connective tissue sac that surrounds the heart. And that sac is double layered, meaning that it is made of two layers. One of them is adherent to the heart, and the other is a bit away from the first one. So if this is the cardiac silhouette that represents the contour of the heart, so if we change the color to make it more visible, so the first layer of the pericardium will be adherent to the heart, and the second layer is continuous with the first layer and turns around the first layer. So the pericardium is a tough connective tissue sac, but meanwhile, it's a double membrane. So it's a tough membrane. It is a connective tissue membrane, of course. And as you can see in the picture, it's transparent and it's firm. So it's highly protective to the heart. So it's a tough, firm connective tissue membrane. And that firmness is important to protect the heart. And meanwhile, there is a minimal amount of fluid that is normally secreted by the cells that line the pericardial sac, and that minimal ultra-thin layer of liquid or fluid is called the pericardial fluid. So normally there is a small amount of pericardial fluid in between the inner and outer layers of the pericardium. But if this amount of pericardial fluid abnormally increases, so we would have a condition known as pericardial effusion. So pericardial effusion means the abnormal accumulation of fluid in between the two layers of the pericardium. And there are many reasons for pericardial effusion. One of the most important reasons is an inflammatory condition. For example, viral pericarditis may result in inflammation of the pericardium, and when the pericardial tissue is inflamed, there will be secretion of fluid because, as you know, of the histamine and vasodilatation that occurs. But sometimes it's not due to secretion, but due to abnormal accumulation of fluid, for example, in cases of heart failure, and we're going to discuss this later on. Whether it's due to inflammation or due to heart failure, pericardial effusion will result in enlargement of the cardiac silhouette, meaning that there will be an increased cardiothoracic ratio. There will be an increased cardiothoracic ratio, although the heart itself is not enlarged. Although there is no cardiomegaly, but the cardiac silhouette in X-ray is enlarged, as we have seen before in the previous X-rays that we studied. The cardiac silhouette is enlarged because around the heart there is excessive fluid. What's the importance of the physiological amounts of fluid, the minimal amounts of fluid that are present around the heart? To prevent friction, to minimize friction. Is there a risk of friction between the two layers of the pericardium? Yes, of course, because the heart is all the time contracting and relaxing. So the heart is moving. And as the heart is contracting and relaxing, contracting and expanding, there is a risk of friction between the two layers. And if there is friction, there will be inflammation. So we don't want to have inflammation with every beat of the heart. So in order to minimize friction, we have this amount of pericardial fluid that is normally secreted. In this slide, we're going to see a transverse section of the heart or a cross section of the heart. And that in that transverse section of the heart, we make sure that the four valves appear, the four internal valves in the heart appear in our section, meaning that if we take the section in the heart, we will make sure that our transverse section will pass through the four valves, because you can see here the tricuspid valve on the right side. You can see here the mitral valve to the left. You can see here the pulmonary valve between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery. And you can see the aortic valve between the left ventricle and the aorta. So we have four valves inside the heart that regulate the flow of blood inside the heart. We have the tricuspid valve and the pulmonary valve on the right side. We have the mitral valve and the aortic valve on the left side. And these four valves have an important function, which is to regulate the flow of blood, to regulate the flow of blood. Why do they regulate the flow of blood? Because you know that the valves act as one-way doors. They act as one-way doors. They allow flow of blood in one direction only and prevent the backflow of blood. Concerning the tricuspid valve and the mitral valve, we can say that the tricuspid valve, which is seen here, and the mitral valve, which is seen there, both valves, the tricuspid valve that is present between the right atrium and the right ventricle, and the mitral valve that is present between the left atrium and the left ventricle, we can say that they control the flow of blood inside the heart. So they control blood flow, or sometimes instead of saying blood flow, we say hemodynamics. Hemodynamics, it's the same, because hemo means blood and dynamics means movement. They control blood flow or hemodynamics inside the heart. What do we mean by inside the heart? We mean that it is from one chamber of the heart to another. Inside the heart means from the atrium or one atrium to the corresponding ventricle. So blood is actually flowing in between the chambers of the heart. This is concerning the tricuspid valve and the mitral valve. But if we come to the pulmonary valve, this one, the pulmonary valve, the one I'm shading black, the pulmonary valve that lies between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery. This valve regulates the blood flow from the right ventricle to the pulmonary artery. The pulmonary artery is outside the heart. It's a major vessel that lies outside the heart. So concerning the pulmonary valve, and similarly concerning the aortic valve, it regulates the flow of blood between the left ventricle and the aorta. Because as you can see, this is the aorta. It passes behind the pulmonary artery. Again, the aorta is not part of the heart. Both the aorta and the pulmonary artery are major vessels that carry the blood away from the heart. So they do not form part of the heart. So we can say that the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve also control the blood flow. They control blood flow, or they control hemodynamics, but we cannot say that they control blood flow or hemodynamics inside the heart, but from the ventricles to the corresponding major vessels, from the ventricles to the corresponding artery, which is to the corresponding major arteries, the aorta or the pulmonary artery. Okay. Coming back to this diagram. So in this diagram, we have made a transverse section, and we are looking end on, or we are looking at the top of this transverse section in order to see how the tricuspid valve consists of three cusps or three connective tissue leaflets. Every one of these cusps is a connective tissue leaflet. It looks like a small leaf, and we call this a cusp. So the tricuspid valve is not one piece. Of course, it is open in order to allow the passage of blood, but it's a three-slit opening. So it has three slits or narrow openings to allow the passage of blood. On the other hand, this is on the right side of the heart, or the right division of the heart. And this valve, the tricuspid valve, regulates the flow of blood or separates the right atrium from the right ventricle. On the other hand, we have the mitral valve, which also has another name, which is the bicuspid valve. And the bicuspid valve has only two connective tissue leaflets, or two cusps, and it separates the left atrium above from the left ventricle below. And of course, we don't see the atrium and we don't see the ventricle, because we are just seeing the level at which, or the section at which, the four valves are present. So it regulates the flow of blood from the left atrium to the left ventricle. So here we are talking about the left side. And then we have the aortic valve, that one, the aortic valve, that one, and the pulmonary valve. And you can see that the two valves, the aortic valve and the pulmonary valves, are not made of leaflets. They are made of three pocket-like structures. Imagine you're looking at a deep pocket. So actually, every one of these valves looks like this. So you have this sign, this sign in the middle, and we have three cusps or cup-shaped structures here, or pocket-shaped structures, and you're looking at the pocket from above. So this is the first pocket, this is the second pocket, and that is the third pocket. Of course, these pockets can sometimes be filled with blood, or can much filled with blood, or can sometimes have less blood, and we will see when. If we look at this aortic valve or pulmonary valve, because they look like each other, if we look at them not from above, but from the sides, we will see that they look like three adjacent pockets like this at the beginning of the aorta. So these are the walls of the aorta, and the valve is present at the beginning of the aorta. This is the left ventricle, this is the aorta, and those are the three pocket-like structures or cusps. Of course, when these pockets are full with blood or full of blood, they close the valve. They close the valve. For example, when the left ventricle contracts and pumps blood into the aorta, it's normal that these three pockets will be filled with blood and will get bigger, and when they get bigger, they become more adjacent to each other and the valve closes. On the other hand, during relaxation of the ventricle, when the ventricle does not pump blood, the pockets will not be empty, but they will have less blood. So they will be less engorged with blood. And when they are less engorged with blood, they are not adjacent to each other. So there are spaces in between. So we say that the valve is open. So the valve closes when the valve closes after the ventricle pump blood and fill them with blood, or fill the pockets with blood. And when the ventricles do not pump blood, the pockets are no more adjacent with each other, and the valve gets open. So here we are talking about the AV valves hemodynamics, or the flow of blood across the AV valves. And when we say the AV valves, we mean the atrioventricular valves. So AV valves stands for atrioventricular valves, and we actually have two atrioventricular valves. We have the tricuspid valve between the right atrium and the right ventricle. So it's on the right side of the heart. And we have the bicuspid valve, or the mitral valve, between the left atrium and the left ventricle. So the atrioventricular valve on the right side is called the tricuspid valve, and the atrioventricular valve on the left side is called the bicuspid valve, or the mitral valve. Now, let's see how the process occurs. We're going to open a new screen to see how the atrioventricular valves work. Now, imagine that this is the right atrium, and that is the left atrium, and this is a longitudinal section in the heart, and therefore we have the right ventricle, and we have here the left ventricle. Okay, so while the ventricles are relaxed, during ventricular relaxation. And by the way, ventricular relaxation is called diastole. So what is diastole? Diastole simply means ventricular relaxation. While the ventricles are relaxed, the atrioventricular valves should be open. Why should they be open? In order to allow the passage of blood from, in order to allow the flow of blood from the atria to the ventricles. Actually, the flow of blood, so when the valves are open, blood flows from each atrium to its corresponding ventricle, from each atrium to its corresponding ventricle, meaning that blood will flow from the right atrium to the right ventricle, and from the left atrium to the left ventricle. Actually, blood flows by gravity, but during that period, the ventricles are relaxed. But at the end, there is a small atrial contraction or atrial systole in order to push some more blood from the atria to the ventricles. This is what happens during ventricular relaxation. And now we're going to see what happens during ventricular contraction. Actually, what happens during ventricular contraction will be the opposite, meaning that the valves will be closed. First of all, why do ventricles contract? Ventricles contract after they have been relaxed, because they are now full of blood and they want to start pumping that blood. They want to start pumping that blood to the aorta and the pulmonary artery. So after diastole has ended, we have a new stage in the cardiac cycle, because these events we are describing are the events of one cardiac cycle. One cardiac cycle actually is relaxation followed by contraction, ventricular relaxation followed by ventricular contraction. You might be asking or wondering, why I am not mentioning the atria. Of course, during ventricular relaxation, the atria undergo changes, contraction or relaxation, and similarly during contraction. But we are now focusing on the ventricles because they are more important, and because if we discuss both changes, those of the atria and those of the ventricles at the same time, it would become very complicated. So we will keep this to a later stage when you've assimilated what I'm saying now. So the second event in the cardiac cycle will be ventricular contraction. We called ventricular relaxation diastole. How do we call ventricular contraction? We call it systole. Systole. Now that the ventricles, whether the right ventricle or the left ventricle, have been filled with blood, whether it is deoxygenated dull red blood, deoxygenated blood on the right side or oxygenated blood on the left side, now they are full with blood, they are distended, and every ventricle wants to push its blood into the corresponding artery. The right ventricle wants to pump blood into the pulmonary artery, and the left ventricle wants to pump blood into the aorta. When the ventricles start contraction, the pressure inside them increases, because when they contract, the volume of inside the ventricle increases. So there will be the volume decreases. So we will have, during contraction, there will be decreased intraventricular volume. The volume inside the ventricles will diminish because the blood is being compressed by the contracting myocardial muscles. And when the intraventricular volume diminishes, what happens is that the pressure increases inside the ventricles. At that moment, the increased pressure inside the ventricles will push upward on the leaflets of the valves, and therefore the valves will move upwards. And when they move upwards like this, they will get closed. So the trigger to close the valve is the increased pressure. The increased pressure pushes the valve leaflets upwards, And when the valve leaflets are pushed upwards, they become exactly horizontal. And when they become horizontal, they close. And the valve has to be perfectly closed to achieve the second function of the valve. So perfect closure is important to achieve the second function of the valve. What was the first function of the valve? The first function of the valve was to allow passage of blood from the atria to the ventricles. But now the second function of the valve is to prevent backflow of blood from the ventricle to the atrium during ventricular contraction. So why do the valves close? They close first because they are pushed upward. This is the reason why they close, or the mechanism how they close. They close because when the ventricles contract, the pressure inside the ventricular chambers increases, the leaflets are pushed upward, they become horizontal, and they perfectly close. But what's the goal of closing them during ventricular contraction? To avoid regurgitation or backflow of blood from the ventricles to the atria. And this is what's written here: as the ventricles pump blood, and pumping blood means that the ventricles are contracting, and this is therefore systole of the ventricles. The blood flows out of the heart into the large vessels. The increased blood flow will close the atrioventricular valves to prevent blood from flowing backward from the ventricles to the atria. Now that we have finished the structure and function of the atrioventricular valves, we move on to the semilunar valves. The semilunar valves have a different mechanism. We will open a new screen to see how the semilunar valves work. Now, if we imagine that this is the right ventricle, if we imagine that this is the right ventricle, and the right ventricle is full of deoxygenated blood at the end of its relaxation or at the end of its diastole, and now the right ventricle will start right ventricular contraction or right ventricular systole. So we assume that the tricuspid valve should be or is perfectly closed. But where is this blood going? What's the destination? It's going into the pulmonary artery. So at the beginning of right ventricular systole, the right ventricle will contract. The right ventricle will contract. And when the right ventricle contracts, it will pump blood into the pulmonary artery. It will pump blood, so it pumps blood into the pulmonary artery. And as it is pumping blood into the pulmonary artery and during the whole systole, the three pockets of the pulmonary valve are being filled with blood. So as it is pumping blood into the pulmonary artery, the pockets of the pulmonary valve pockets are being filled. So I'm using the present continuous tense because it's a process that takes a few seconds, so or a certain period of time. So they are being filled with time. They are being filled with time with blood when they are being filled with blood during contraction. So this indicates you that during the whole right ventricular systole, the pulmonary valve should be open. It should be open in order to allow passage of blood from the right ventricle to the right atrium. At the end of systole, the right ventricle decides that there is no more blood to pump to the pulmonary artery. This doesn't mean that the right ventricle becomes empty, but the amount of blood inside the right ventricle diminishes, and it's now high time that the right ventricle takes a break and relaxes. So after ventricular systole ends, we start ventricular relaxation, this period of rest of the right ventricle. And the right ventricle starts the right ventricular relaxation or diastole after it has pumped all the blood in it. So we now start a new period in the cardiac cycle, which is right ventricular relaxation or right ventricular diastole. When right ventricular relaxation starts, the pressure inside the right ventricle diminishes because it has already pumped most of its blood in the pulmonary artery. To the extent, where does the pressure diminish? Inside the right ventricle, to the extent that it becomes less than the pressure inside the pulmonary artery. So now when the right ventricle starts to relax and to enlarge its chamber, there is a great risk that blood backflows from the pulmonary artery to the right ventricle. This doesn't happen, but I'm talking about the risk. So how would we manage to, or how would the heart manage to prevent this backflow that might occur because the pressure in the pulmonary artery is higher than in the right ventricle? By closing the valves. And now the valve is ready to be closed at the beginning of diastole. So at the beginning of diastole, the pulmonary artery is closed. Just when the right ventricle decides to start relaxation, so at the beginning of diastole, the pulmonary artery starts to close or is already closed, because this is normal, because relaxation occurs after contraction, and during the whole process of contraction the pockets were filling with blood. So at the end of contraction and at the beginning of diastole, the pockets are full of blood and they are very close to each other and the valve is closed. So as a general rule, during the whole systole, the pulmonary valve is open to allow the passage of blood from the ventricles to the pulmonary artery during contraction. And during the whole diastole, the pulmonary valve should be closed in order to prevent backflow of blood from the pulmonary artery to the right ventricle. All what we have said on the pulmonary artery, the right ventricle, and the pulmonary valve applies exactly on the aortic valve, but the only difference is in the quality of blood that passes through the valve. So the semilunar valves open during, that's why we are talking about the two valves at the same time. The semilunar valves open during ventricular contraction to allow blood flow into the corresponding large arteries, the aorta and the pulmonary artery, and close during relaxation or during diastole to prevent backflow of blood into the ventricles. And now we are going to see the circulation inside the heart. How does the blood circulate inside the heart? Of course, we know that the right atrium receives deoxygenated blood from the superior vena cava that carries deoxygenated blood from the head and neck, and from the inferior vena cava that gets blood back from the lower parts of the body. So all this will accumulate in the right atrium, and then the right atrium will pass this blood, deoxygenated blood that it collected from the whole body, into the right ventricle. And then the right ventricle will send this deoxygenated blood through the pulmonary artery that carries this deoxygenated blood to the lungs, where it will be unloaded from carbon dioxide. We know that deoxygenated blood is poor in oxygen, rich in carbon dioxide, and it will be loaded with freshly coming oxygen from the atmospheric air. That's why the pulmonary artery is an exception to arteries, because the pulmonary artery carries deoxygenated blood. It is the only artery in the human body or in adult persons that carries deoxygenated blood. This procedure or process that occurs in the lungs to unload from carbon dioxide and load with oxygen is what we call the alveolo-capillary exchange, because it occurs due to an exchange between the air sacs or alveoli and the blood capillaries of the lungs, as we will be seeing on the next slide. So circulation inside the heart, blood returning to the heart from all parts of the body other than the lungs, but there is some deoxygenated blood that also comes from the lungs, and we will be explaining this later on, has a high concentration of carbon dioxide and a low concentration of oxygen. And this deoxygenated blood enters the right atrium, as I have just explained, from the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. I'm just reading what's on the slide. The right atrium will pass this deoxygenated blood and pump it to the right ventricle, and then the muscles of the right ventricle will contract during systole. And by the way, the contraction of the right ventricle occurs exactly during the contraction of the left ventricle and will force this blood into the pulmonary arteries, which carries this deoxygenated blood to the lungs, where alveolo-capillary exchange occurs. In the lungs, what happens is that we have deoxygenated blood that's coming from the, let it be on the right side. So this is one of the blood capillaries in the lungs, and it has just received deoxygenated blood through a pulmonary arteriole that is a branch of the pulmonary artery, and it is deoxygenated blood that is rich in carbon dioxide, poor in oxygen. The pulmonary arterioles divide into very small blood vessels, as you know, called capillaries, and these capillaries have pores. And through these pores, of course, every capillary in the lung is surrounded by an alveolus or an air sac. So we are now where? We are now in the lungs, inside the lungs, and we are focusing on one of the air sacs of the lungs. So actually, carbon dioxide will pass or diffuse from the blood capillary to the air sacs, whereas oxygen will diffuse from the air sacs to the blood capillary. Why are they adopting those directions? This is according to their concentration gradient. So here, oxygen will enter the capillary and carbon dioxide will leave the capillary. Why does carbon dioxide diffuse from the capillary to the air sacs? Because it has a higher concentration in the capillary. Why does oxygen diffuse from the air sac to the blood capillary? Because it has a higher concentration in the air sac. So every gas is diffusing, so the process is diffusion down concentration gradient, meaning that it is diffusing from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. So gradually, the capillary blood will be oxygenated. The capillary blood will be loaded with oxygen, and these capillaries will form arterioles, and then the arteries, which are the four pulmonary arteries, not arteries, those capillaries, because they are returning from the lungs to the heart, they will form venules, and the venules will collect in order to form a pulmonary vein. So we will find here that we have pulmonary veins, and these are the four pulmonary veins that return to the left atrium. So in the lungs, carbon dioxide diffuses out of the blood and oxygen diffuses into the blood. The oxygenated blood returns, as we have just said, to the left atrium of the heart via four pulmonary veins, and then it is pumped to the left ventricle. The left ventricle then passes the oxygenated blood to the aorta, and the aorta transports it to all parts of the body. And that's why the left ventricle is the thickest chamber in the body. In the following slides, we will talk about the control of heartbeats and the sinoatrial node, which we have already covered. So I'll stop here and will be reading the next slides in class, just reviewing them because we did them in the muscular, when we were studying the muscular system. Thank you so much, and you will be requested to take notes of the video and to get a hard copy of your notes tomorrow in the classroom. Thank you, and see you tomorrow.